Before you begin making your provisional, you need to make sure that you have a stent of the tooth that you're going to be restoring. So before you can do that, you need to have a duplicate cast of the tooth that you're working on. Make sure you trim it in the shape of a horseshoe, and that way the stent material can best adapt to where you're going to be restoring. So let's get started. Get your stent material, place it shiny side down. Make sure it's nice and snug. Place your cast right here. Turn the heat on, and what you're going to be waiting for is for the stent material to be nice and droopy. When it's nice and droopy, then we're going to turn the vacuum down and go down. So let's go ahead and wait for that to finish.
Now that you've made your stent, I'm going to be demonstrating how you make the acrylic provisional on your prepared Typodont tooth. The stent that you've made and you've cut down to size, you then use a small round burr to drill a vent hole in the top. This allows some of the material to flow up and then keep the acrylic material in the stent when you're taking it on and off the tooth. I like to use a disposable brush to brush the Vaseline onto the Typodont tooth and the gum surface. In the clinic, you'll use a water-based material instead of Vaseline. We now mix the material in the little cup. Stir it up. And when it starts to get a little bit thicker and lose its gloss, just a tiny bit, we're going to pour it into our stent. So it just mixed in the cup and it's starting to lose its gloss a little bit. We now pour slowly into the stent. You want to make sure that there's no voids, so it'll slowly go in. You let it sit in there a little bit. You can lift it up onto the tooth. And then we can go ahead and seat it, pushing down on the two teeth next to it. We don't want to push right on the tooth because that could distort the margins in the tooth and the anatomy. Okay, now we can lift from the bottom so we're not distorting the margins. Pull it off and clean off the excess really quickly before we seat it back on again. It's important that you remove it, especially from the occlusal surfaces, so the stent can seat fully. We'll place it back. And we wait now again. We can keep checking this to see that it's getting a little bit harder before we start taking it on and off. So now I'm just going to keep lifting it on and off, making sure everything's clean, placing it back on. Okay, I'm going to use my nice tapered burr to start taking off a little bit of the excess. It's important that you don't take away your contact, so if it helps you to make a little pencil mark where you know the contact is, then do that. And right along the margins, where you know you have excess, just go in like this, and it'll take it right off to where your finish line is. Now that we've trimmed it, we want to see, and there's a couple areas where the Explorer sticks, and we know we have an open margin. We check the lingual side too and interproximally. So we know we want to do a little bit of either relining or a brush bead technique. So what I like to do is mix up a liquidy version of our mixture and then run it along with a small instrument or small round one and just dab it in right where you want to reline. And then the capillary action, because it's a more liquidy solution, will take it up under the margins. You can do that on the lingual side too. So after we've done that brush bead, filling in the margins. You let it sit on there a couple minutes so it hardens. And then you want to gently pry it off, and you see that everything that we just added looks good. So now we're going to trim that up just a little bit more. And then we'll keep trying it on the tooth before we go in and try and polish. So now we're using our maxillary typodont to check the occlusion. Obviously with your patient, they can close down and let you know what's high or not. But for this, a quick way to tell is to articulate them together and see if it rocks, which it does just a little bit. So we're going to put our articulating paper in, close it down, and mush it, and see where our marks are. So we can see a couple of high points in areas where we don't want that, so we're going to trim that down just a little bit.
Now that your provisional's done, we want to go ahead and polish it. Today we're just going to be using a medium pumice, but ideally you would like to start with a coarse pumice and then move from medium to fine. Okay, we're going to start by putting the lathe on the 1500 speed, keeping in mind to make sure that you're holding your provisional so that the wheel is turning away from your margins. Now we're just going to grab some of this pumice, make sure it's nice and moist. You can put it directly onto the provisional. And now you want to keep in mind when you're polishing your interproximal areas to use a light touch. You don't want to have to polish away your contact and then replace it later. And then also when you're polishing your occlusal surface, be gentle too. You don't want to ruin your anatomy. After you've used the pumice, your final step is the acryluster, and that will give us a really smooth, shiny finish. Now with the lathe, you can set it to 3000 for this. If you're more comfortable with it, keeping it on 1500, that's fine too. Make sure that you change out your muslin buff. Don't use the same one you've been using for pumice, and once you use it for acryluster, don't use it for anything else. To put the acryluster on the wheel, we're going to go ahead and turn it on and just hold it right up against it until you see that nice pink coating all throughout. At this point, you're just going to follow the same procedure as with the pumice, going all around the provisional. Be careful of the margins, and just keep going with this until you get a nice, smooth, and shiny finish.
This is Dr. Donaldson and his tips on how to make an acrylic provisional.
First off, I like to use it mix it in the stent. I put the powder and the liquid in the stent and give it a little bit of a stir. Before I put it in there, I like to put a couple little holes, like vent holes in, to lock it into the stent. As soon as you do that, you put it in water to keep the monomer from volatilizing. As soon as you do that, it says start setting, you put it in the mouth, take it out, put it back in the water, in and out of the mouth, done.
Thank you. This is Dr. Kolos giving his tips on how to make an acrylic provisional.
All right, generally what I like to do is I like to take an acrylic stent and use a number 2 or number 4 round burr, which I punch a hole in the occlusal surface of the tooth that I'm working on, and I like to do it from the inside out, so there's no flash of extra acrylic coming down inside into your actual temporary that you're going to be making. I like to pre-mix the acrylic in a cup to the point where I can still pour it down inside the stent. If it's a little runny and it doesn't hold itself that well, you can hit it with a little bit of air for a second to lose the shine on it. Seat it on the teeth, but I seat it on the ends of the stent. I never push down the center of it. There should be a little chimney that comes up of material on the occlusal surface. I like to pat that down a little bit with a finger, because what it does is it makes a little mushroom on top and locks it in. What I start doing is put my fingernails up around the flanges of the stent, and I start to tease the stent up a little bit. Then I put the stent back down again, tease it up a little bit down again. If time is a situation that you're dealing with, then I do like to put it in some warm water for a few seconds to be able to set up a little bit faster. But basically what it does is it locks the temporary inside the stent so it doesn't come out of the stent while you're trying to lift it up. Also make sure that you use like a bender brush with some Vaseline on it and go ahead and coat the surfaces around the tooth. In the mouth, a lot of times we try not to use the Vaseline, we try to use another separator on there. If you use some glycerin or something like that, that works really well, or even KY jelly, which is fine to use in that area, but that's a glycerin format too.
Thank you. This is Dr. Mascara giving tips on how to finish and polish a provisional.
Hello, very important before you finishing and polishing a provisional, you want to make sure you have a smooth texture of your acrylic. Different ways to achieve that is you can use your green and yellow rubber points to give you a nicer texture for the acrylic for a better finishing before you actually do your polishing with pumice and acryluster. Because if you don't have that before, you don't have an effective polishing on your restoration. Also, before the sandpaper is a very good element also to use to give fine texture of the acrylic before you do the final polishing.
Thank you.